Okay, everybody, let us begin. And is Jay Wickersham still here? Because well, that's too bad, because I'm quoting him again. We're just gonna, it's like a sharing economy right from the get-go. His opening remarks in his presentation this morning really, I think, are a perfect jumping off point for this panel. And at least now that he's not here, I don't have to worry about whether I'm quoting him accurately. He said something like, whenever you have a legal entitlement, the water, and we'll call it the benefits, flow uphill towards the money. And I think for our purposes, he was talking about architects not being where the money is, and for our purposes, perhaps the focus of the panel should be that the money doesn't appear to be in the direction of the workers either. So this is a panel on the sharing economy, and broadly it's about the communities that are created by the sharing economy, I suppose with particular focus on the workers. And wow, do we have an interdisciplinary group here. So we have 2 lawyers, 1 political economist, 1 computer scientist, 3 professors, and 1 practicing lawyer. I realize I can do math. That's not, we have fewer people than that, but you'll just have to guess who's what, partly based on their biographies. So now, I will also say I've been studying the sharing economy for several years now, and when we talked about what each of these panelists were going to discuss, I learned new things from each of them. What they have to say, I think, is truly innovative. I think you'll enjoy it. And now let me introduce them and get out of the way so that we have time for robust both presentations as well as discussion. So they're seated in the order in which they will speak. First, Krista Wilson, who is an assistant professor of computer science in the College of Computer and Information Science here at Northeastern University. His research focuses on algorithmic auditing, i.e. the process of examining black box systems to understand how they work, the data they use, and ultimately how these algorithms impact individuals. Can you guess what he's going to talk about today? So I think he's going to give us some information. We may have to ask some people to leave the room in case we don't want them to hear it. He has a PhD from the University of California in Santa Barbara, and his research is supported by an NSF Career Award, the European Commission, the Knight Foundation, and the Data Transparency Lab. He's also a plaintiff in the Sandvig versus Lynch test case that was filed last summer. So that's Christo. Next, we will have Jason Jackson, who is a future faculty fellow in the Department of Political Science here at Northeastern, and in the fall will be an assistant professor of political economy back at MIT. His research focuses on the relationship between states and markets and contexts ranging from the politics of monopoly and foreign investment in India, from the late colonial period to the present, to also the sharing economy and urban transportation markets in contemporary cities in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. I say he's returning to MIT because he has a PhD in political economy from MIT, as well as a BA in economics from Princeton, a master's in development economics from the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, and a master's in public administration from Harvard's Kennedy School. Third, we have Professor Veena Dubal, who's an associate professor of law at UC Hastings College of Law. Her research focuses on the intersection of law and social change in the work context. She uses empirical methodologies to study the meaning of law in the lives of precarious workers, the role of public interest lawyering in social change movements, and the normative social influences of the law for work, race, and family. She has a JD and PhD from UC Berkeley, let's see, prior to joining the academy, she was a public interest attorney and Berkeley Law Foundation Fellow at the Asian Law Caucus, where she founded a taxi worker project and represented Muslim Americans in civil rights cases. She's talked to a lot of drivers, both in the sharing economy and in the taxi driving economy. And finally, Sushil Jacob, who is an associate at the Tuttle Law Group. This is a law firm that represents business entities that are considering various strategies for increasing employee ownership, including employee and worker cooperatives, employee-owned trusts, and internet-based platform cooperatives. Sushil was a principal drafter of and counsel to the coalition that passed the California Worker Cooperative Act. If you haven't looked it up, I encourage you to do so. It's an amazing piece of legislation, a model piece of legislation, I hope. Prior to joining the Tuttle Law Group, he worked with the East Bay Community Law Center, where he founded the Green Collar Communities Clinic, which is a CED clinic that assists clients to create green worker-owned businesses as a community empowerment strategy. He also worked in India for a couple of projects, including Just Change, a cooperative of small farmers and indigenous peoples groups in South India. And Sushil serves on the board of the Cooperative Center Federal Credit Union, a 72-year-old financial institution in Berkeley that's owned by 13,000 members. So he is deeply involved in the cooperative movement. So that's the order in which they'll speak. And Krista, take it away.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. I'm Krista Wilson. I'm a professor of computer science here at Northeastern, and I'm an algorithm auditor. So like Jay earlier today, I'm the kind of person who takes things apart. So specifically, what I'm interested in are the algorithms that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. Google search, Facebook newsfeed, these systems that are kind of transparent and ubiquitous, but really can have a deep impact on us, both in terms of the privacy implications, but also kind of the broader social implications. So I'm really focused on things like transparency and accountability. We can't even begin to have a discussion about what these algorithms are doing and the effect they're having, let alone how to regulate them, until we really have examples of what's going on out there and the ways that they can influence us. So I want to briefly talk about some of our work, which has specifically been looking at the sharing in the gig economy. Right? This is a perfect example of the confluence of algorithms and human beings. So the first thing I want to talk about is Uber. Right? So for anyone who's never used Uber before, right, it's a ride-sharing service. It's this app. You hit a button, and a car magically shows up and takes you where you want to go. So we got interested in Uber because they have a dynamic pricing system called surge pricing. Right? So the price is not fixed like a taxi cab. It can change throughout the day. And this is supposed to be sort of wrapped in this veneer of economics, where if there's too few taxis or too many customers, right, the price changes to adapt and equalize the market. But the crucial thing here is that it's not an open market. Right? You can't tell how much supply there is or how much demand there is. You're entirely reliant on Uber to measure this and have some kind of opaque algorithm make these changes. Right? You just have to trust that their system works and is operating to the benefit of customers and drivers. So the question is it actually doing that? Right? It's opaque, it's proprietary, we have no idea what it's actually doing. So the interesting thing about this app, right, is you open it and you get this map and you can see the cars that are available around you. And when those cars disappear, it typically means the car got booked. Right? So you can start to use this data to infer things about supply and demand in the system. So what we did is we pick a city like Boston and we sign up for hundreds of Uber accounts. And we literally blanket the geographic area in this grid of fake Uber accounts. And now we can see all the cars that are driving around and start to measure the characteristics of the Uber system. Right, so one of the first interesting things we saw is that Uber actually has these internal maps they use. Right? We call these surge zones. But basically, they probably had some intern who went and took a map of every city and drew a bunch of lines on it. And they calculate a different price per area. Right, so in Boston, there's essentially an invisible line going down Massachusetts Avenue, separating the Roxbury surge zone from the South End and the Back Bay zones just to the north of it. Once you understand how the system works, you can start to game it. So for example, imagine that you are leaving a bar on Boylston Street, and you see that the surge price there is 3, right, and you don't want to pay that. That's going to be an expensive ride. Well, I can actually tell you that if you walk for 3 or 4 minutes, a couple of blocks into the South End, right, there's no surge over there. You crossed one of these invisible lines, and now all of a sudden, you don't have to pay a high price anymore. Of course, Uber's not thrilled about any of this. So one of the things that we really wanted to understand in our study was about the economic incentives that underlie the surge pricing algorithm. Right? So again, it's kind of wrapped in this veneer of economics. Right? They're trying to equalize supply and demand by adjusting the price. Right? Have people booking rides. Right? It's an elastic kind of system. So the question is it actually working? Right? This is a mechanism. Are people responding to it in the way that we would expect? Is it reducing demand, right, pricing people out of the market? Is it also raising supply by incentivizing drivers with the potential of earning a bonus, essentially? Right? Does it work? Now, the cool thing about our data is that it's full of these natural experiments. Right? There's times of the day where one area is surging and an adjacent area is not. Right? And this is potentially a very clear signal to a driver. Right? if you want to make extra money, drive into the area that's surging, right? That's what you would expect to happen. Supply in that area increases. It turns out that this mechanism is actually not working very well, though, right? So what we see is that it's very, very good at suppressing demand, right? Customers don't want to pay high prices, but it's also really actually bad at increasing the supply. So you can actually watch drivers in real time drive away from surges, right? So again, you have kind of this opaque system that it's supposed to work one way, right? It's wrapped in this veneer of economics, but in fact, the implementation doesn't work the way you would expect, right? And as a driver or a customer, right, you have no ability to see this because, right, the system is opaque. Another interesting thing we found is that there was a bug in Uber. Right, so imagine that you and I leave this building right now, we walk outside, we both need a ride, we pull out our phones, but we both get different prices. Now that's a little bit disturbing, right? You and I are at the same place at the same time. Why are we getting charged different prices? Right, the first time we saw this, we actually thought maybe it was some kind of price discrimination, right? Uber knew something about one of these customers, they're going to charge them a little extra. But it turns out that's not the case, right? We actually talked to their engineers. This was a bug, right? So this was happening for about 7 months. They were giving customers incorrect prices, and they didn't realize it. Right? So again, you have this problem of it's a big, complex system. Right? Things arise from it that you don't necessarily expect. Right? And we understand that this happens in a security context. Right? You want to look at algorithms for security vulnerabilities. But there's these other kinds of problems as well that aren't really security, right? But they clearly have an effect on people. The last study that I'll mention very briefly is we looked at gig economy sites like TaskRabbit and Fiverr. These are the kind of sites where you can pay people to do little jobs for you. Right? So this is TaskRabbit. For anyone who's never used this, it's a site where you can go and find people to walk your dog or fix your leaky faucet. Right? It's kind of an odd job website. So our interest is whether there was racial and gender discrimination on this platform. So what we did is we started looking at the social feedback. Right? So this is a very common thing in the sharing economy. You can rate the workers, right? And you see that on this website. These workers have ratings and reviews. So I hire these people to do something for me, and then afterwards I give them a star rating, right? Did you do a good job walking my dog? Unfortunately, what we found is that this feedback is highly biased. Right, so the female workers on the platform get significantly less reviews than everyone else. And in particular, African-American workers get rated more harshly than all other workers. So this is disturbing, absolutely. But it's also not unexpected in the sense that we know there's discrimination in the labor economy, right? I'm just finding it in another sort of venue. What is really interesting is how this relates to the search engine on the website. Right, so when you go on this site and you want a worker, you have to search for them. You say, I need a dog walker, and you get this list of people. The problem is that these lists also end up being biased. Right? One of the strongest effects was that the female workers tend to appear lower than male workers. Now this is entirely this is an observational study, right? I can't prove causation here. But my suspicion is that the way the search engine works is that it uses the social feedback. Right? I need to rank these people. Well, it seems like the obvious way to do this is you put the 5-star worker at the top. Right? That's kind of the intuitive way to do it. But you don't think about the deeper implications. Right? Where did that data come from? Right? That data itself is not neutral. It encodes human biases. Now you have a biased algorithm. So this is sort of the space we're playing in, trying to make these systems more transparent and foster a debate about how this data is being used, especially in the gig economy where workers are essentially, they don't have as much power as the platform providers themselves. Right? How do we address this imbalance? How do we even know what's going on?
Okay, great. So thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me to join this panel of really 3 other fabulous co-panelists. And a moderator who's done a lot of work in this area. So what I thought I'd talk about today is something which I hope complements certainly Krista's, but then also Veena and Sushil's presentations by thinking about some of the implications for corporate power that arise from the sharing or platform economy. And to do so, I'm going to talk about ways in which platform firms, and much of this has to do with the particular structure that platform firms take, and that is they are constituted by sets of algorithms, as Krista just described, that seek to match people on both sides. So for example, in the case of Uber that Krista just talked about, they seek to match drivers with riders, right? So they're sort of performing a market-making role in many respects, using a lot of the kind of logics of economics that Krista talked about. But what I wanted to do was to talk about ways in which the platform firm is, I think, in really interesting ways, is inverting conventional logics of collective action. That is, there are typical ways in which we think about how firms, so capital and labor interact, right? So in the conventional capitalist model, right, so this has been around with us for a very long time, workers are thought about as concentrated interests, right? They can organize, they can bargain with management, they can lobby the state, for example, through tripartite measures or by having labor wings in political parties, something we don't see very much in this country, but certainly is a feature of many other states, in particular sort of more corporatist states. So workers have particular kinds of political power in the broader economic realm. By contrast, consumers for a long time have been conceptualized as diffuse interests, right? They're very difficult to organize, they're very difficult to sort of bring together, even around common interests. And so I think a recent really good example of this, at least a way in which this has been in the news, has been efforts to really mobilize consumers in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, which a certain senator from Massachusetts is very well known for driving. Now, why is this important? So historically, this has been really central in the sort of structure of capitalism, right? So a key thing with the factory, right, the sort of eponymous sort of organization of capitalist development was the fact that it brought workers together, right? So workers are no longer doing piecework in their homes, but rather were organized under one roof. This, on one hand, promoted greater efficiency, which we know from Smith and, of course, many others. On the other hand, it allowed workers to interact with each other, to talk, and to mobilize together. So this is a really fundamental element of the sort of conventional capitalist model. The platform economy, by contrast, is really quite different in a couple of key ways. Workers now are fragmented, something that I think Veena and Sushil will probably talk about. This, sort of classically the kind of Uber model, right? So workers are contractors. They're not employees. They no longer operate under a single roof, so to speak. Now they are sort of like operating totally on their own. Even if you compare it to conventional modes in similar markets, like taxi drivers, for example, there are particular spaces where taxi drivers could get together, right? So classically, they could get together in the taxi company back in the days when they all sort of were employees of the taxi company. Think of the sitcom Taxi, for example, Danny DeVito, for those who may remember it. Is a nice example. But even in today's sort of more fragmented world of taxi work, as Veena's work has shown, there still are venues where taxi drivers can get together, right? Like the airports, those really long airport lines, not the ones that we wait for when we get off the plane, but the ridiculously long ones that taxi drivers sit in the airport parking lots, which maybe sometimes you see over the sort of like flyovers and stuff, right? So this is the sort of, but in the platform economy, they're really quite fragmented. However, and this is a crucial difference, by contrast, consumers who were previously considered to be diffuse can now be brought to, their efforts can now be garnered by platform firms who not only can lobby the state directly using kind of conventional modes of corporate engagement, but they can also mobilize consumers really directly to mobilize the state, in particular to lobby for particular kinds of regulation that they want on their own behalf. So to sort of lay this out, I'm going to provide two cases that I think provide really interesting examples of this kind of effort on the part of platform firms broadly. But interestingly, they generated quite different results, which I hope will provide us with interesting material to discuss in the Q&A. So the two key cases, the first is going to be Uber in New York City, and the second will be Facebook in India. In particular, what's known as Free Basics, which was Facebook's attempt of creating free access to the internet in India as well as in many other developing countries. Okay, so first, Uber in New York. So as I discussed before, there's a kind of conventional way in which corporate lobbying, or lobbying more broadly, takes place. I'm cheating a little bit because this image is actually from Boston, it's not from New York. But nevertheless, it's a general idea of what a city council meeting looks like. So this is a city council meeting that was pulled together to discuss new legislation or proposed legislation around transportation network companies. And so what do we see? Well, we see, of course, like a panel with like a bunch of people sitting up front. So those are probably the city council members. And then we see a whole bunch of people in the audience. And of course, most prominently, we see all these people in yellow shirts, which of course are taxi drivers, right? Who have been mobilized by the taxi companies to show force, in numbers, to show up at the meeting, wearing all yellow shirts as a sort of show of solidarity, but also as a political show, right? So we are here, we're important, we're a significant part of the constituency that would be affected by this legislation, right? So this we can think about as kind of normal politics, right? And of course, Uber as well as Lyft also had representatives in the audience wearing black shirts and pink shirts as well. And of course, we know that this is one element of kind of the lobbying process, which is kind of out in the open, sort of what we imagine as a democratic engagement process. But of course, there are also closed-door meetings and so forth that take place, right? But it's all kind of what we have come to expect, for better or worse. However, what we're seeing now that is new is in New York last summer, when the New York City Council was also discussing new legislation to regulate transportation network companies. Uber put together a really interesting feature on their app, just like the app that Krista described. What was this feature? Well, if you guys use Uber, at the bottom right here, you typically have the various options. Uber X, which is the kind of regular person's car that you hope isn't a axe murderer. It will take you where you want to go. Uber Black for all the fancy people who like rolling around in a nice Mercedes or maybe kind of old school a Lincoln Town Car. And Uber Pool, which is the kind of new sort of general sort of mechanism. It's a bit like a dollar cab. But the interesting thing that they offered was this, right at the very left, you see this button that says De Blasio. What happened is if you press that button, you get this sort of screen on the left, which would say this is what Uber or your options under Uber would look like if the new rules that are being debated by the City Council were passed. A 25-minute wait, which of course for anyone who takes Uber or Lyft, etc., that's a total disaster, right? So nobody wants that. So Uber, being very generous, they offered a very easy solution. They say, well, if you don't like this, you can just press this button and we'll kindly send an email for you to the City Council members, letting them know that you're not really in favor of the legislations that they're proposing. And as it turns out, City Council members received about 1.6 million emails. Right, so this is in New York, which has a population of about 10 million, maybe 20-something million if you sort of consider rather the sort of like broader New York City metro area, right? So this is a new and important way in which these platform firms are able to mobilize consumers in ways we haven't seen, before, right? So, Budweiser can't mobilize beer drinkers in any kind of scale like this in order to get beer prices to lower, even though they probably would really like to. Okay, so I want to contrast this example very quickly with Facebook's efforts in India. So as I mentioned, Facebook put forward this new product called Free Basics. The idea is it would offer free internet. It was very keen to push this new product globally, right? Particularly because of the fact that in wealthy countries, internet penetration is, of course, very high, right? So most people have connections to the internet. Of course, there's lots of variation, especially by income, class, and so forth. But nevertheless, internet penetration rates are very high in the US, in Europe, Japan, etc. Right? So the developing world is the place to go. In the developing world, of course, China is the first stop for everyone because they have the most people. But of course, Facebook is banned in China, so that's a problem. But India, of course, is very much open for business. And so Facebook, sort of fueled by a very strong campaign by its CEO and founder, Mark Zuckerberg, really made a big effort to try to push Free Basics in India. The idea of Free Basics essentially is that Facebook would partner with a couple select telecommunications providers. So in India, there are actually many dozens, actually. Well, there are over a dozen medium to large size mobile phone providers. And the way in which people are going to access the internet in developing countries like India is, of course, over their mobile phones, right? Not on kind of laptops and fixed lines as we do elsewhere. This is the way in which the model will really spread. So Zuckerberg entered on this really big campaign sort of pushing these ideas that connectivity is a human right. We will provide connectivity. We'll help to solve problems of poverty because once you get online, of course, poverty just sort of like vanishes. It's really nice. You can become a market participant. And I think this is where the sharing economy interface is really very important, right? These are ways in which presumably the urban as well as the rural poor, especially in places like India, would be able to access markets, right? However, this really tied into big debates around net neutrality. And net neutrality critics instead argue that Free Basics wasn't this sort of really nice gift from Facebook, but rather was creating what's called a walled garden. Because what would the kicker was, whereas they're providing free access to the internet, it was only for Facebook and a few select partners of Facebook. Right? So in total, in the initial round, maybe about 20-something sites, which included a few really kind of small local Indian sites, and you could do your search through Bing, which anybody who's done search through Bing knows is maybe not the nicest. But Zuckerberg still persisted. So, as part of the campaign with going around India, for example, we went to a village in Rajasthan, have some really nice photo ops with kids in the village. And in fact, they went to this village, as it turns out, because a kid in the village was able to buy a used motorbike using the internet, using like his phone, and he became sort of like a local sensation in the village. Like, oh wow, this is really fabulous. You're able to like buy things, and this became kind of news in India. And so they, the PR people at Facebook smartly selected the city for Zuckerberg to go to. Right, so there's really this big sort of PR campaign to try to push free basics, trying to show how it would really be good for the poor. And this is coupled with kind of conventional modes as well, such as huge billboards, of which there are several hundred around on highways in India, saying support the connected India, support free basics, and so forth. Part of the reason why this became a sort of big public issue is because part of the way in which policy is done in India is that the government oftentimes, in the case of controversial measures, will put out tenders for opinions from the public, right? So they'll open up a part of their website and say, here's a white paper, here's what we're thinking about doing. If you have an opinion, feel free to send in an email. And so it's a way of sort of like garnering feedback in these kinds of contexts. And so many people sort of wrote in both for and against. And again, we see things which are really kind of interesting. So Facebook, on one hand, sort of wrote in their own sort of letters and so forth. And we saw sort of like conventional modes of resistance, right? So people with billboards sort of saying free basics and Facebook are really going to be monopolistic. But Facebook also did something really very interesting, right? So just as Uber did in the context of New York City, Facebook, for all India users, right? So anybody who logged on to Facebook in India would immediately get a message sort of saying, here the government is considering this new legislation around free basics. If you're in favor, which I'm sure you should be, just press this button and we'll send an email in to TRAI. TRAI is the Telecommunications Regulation Authority of India. And again, TRAI received over 1 million submissions. In fact, as it turns out, you didn't have to press OK to this. Even if you looked at the message, right, and hovered on the message for about a minute or so, and remember, everybody gets the message, then an indication will be sent via notification to all of your Facebook friends saying that you were in support. And this classically came up because somebody noted that one of their uncles who had been dead for 2 years apparently was in favor of free basics. And so what were the things that were put out, right? So free basics is the first step to connect 1 billion Indians, opportunities online. This is the sort of Facebook messaging that they sent out to India users. A huge button below, allowing them to send an email to users. But of course, this generated this really sort of strong feedback, as I mentioned, right? Really strong backlash in the context of India. Not just because it was seen as a large firm sort of mobilizing its monopoly power, which is sort of key to the dangers, I think, of ways in which platform firms like Uber, like Facebook, these massive firms, huge valuations, access to really, in many cases like Uber, ridiculous amounts of capital, right, and heavily dependent on the regulation, on regulation, right? They're in heavily regulated arenas, so they really depend on particular kinds of rules by the state in order to generate profits. However, I can report that unlike New York, where the city council eventually backed off of some of the legislation they was considering, perhaps in response, we don't really know, you never really know, but perhaps in response to this sort of onslaught of messaging that they got from those emails, in India, TRAI, the regulatory authority, decided against Facebook's, or the proposal to allow free basics. So, just to conclude, what I wanted to suggest was these large firms that generate huge monopoly presences, not just in the markets in which they operate, but also sort of more broadly in the sharing, as well as the sort of more conventional economy, are mobilizing new ways of generating corporate power, which I think for us as sort of people interested in policy, law, regulation, and so forth, really point to ways in which we need to think differently about how to address these new kinds of issues, and particularly with respect to the kinds of distributional outcomes they may ultimately have. Thanks very much.
So first, I'd really like to thank Rashmi and the conveners of this conference for inviting me and for putting together such important conversations, and of course to my co-panelists, Krista, Jason, and Sushil for being willing to engage in this particular dialogue. So far on this panel, we've heard a bit about the logic or illogic of gig economy algorithms and the ways in which gig economy companies have capitalized off their reach to produce new, perhaps perilous techniques of corporate political engagement. Sushil, Jacob, and I are going to talk for the remainder of the panel in our different but connected presentations about how we might disrupt or at least push back against the type of exploitative and precarious work produced by the technologically enabled gig economy. Let me note as an aside that for the purposes of this paper, we take this precarity as a given, but I and others have documented it in empirical research. Indeed, the ideas and arguments I'll be presenting today arise from my many years of ethnographic engagement with taxi and Uber drivers in San Francisco. And in many ways, because I'm touching on so much, what I'm giving you is sort of a dissatisfying array of snippets across my research. These are the questions that animate my collaboration with Sushil. So Sushil is going to discuss the more interesting part of our paper, which is the possibility of algorithmic governance and platform-based cooperative structures. And I'm going to engage in the much grimmer task of explaining why existing models of achieving worker security, namely through collective bargaining and regulation, just have not and perhaps will not work in the labor platform context. So to begin, what do we mean when we say labor platforms? So this is a typology of digital labor produced by me and my co-investigators in a related project. Of the many kinds of labor platforms that seem to daily proliferate, at least if you live in Silicon Valley like I do, of interest to us in this paper and in my larger work is what we refer to as the low-skill on-demand platform, or the labor brokerage platform. These are platforms like Uber, which we use as our case study, that act as intermediaries, facilitating the selling of labor to perform a task or service for monetary compensation. So we maintain that unlike earlier applications of technology to industry, the technology of the labor platform doesn't necessarily make the worker more productive in the actual production process, as it did, say, in the Fordist context. Instead, technology makes the market more efficient, or arguably more efficient, by lowering transaction costs. So this means that in the labor platform context, a chauffeur driver does not necessarily have to drive harder and longer to raise his wages. Instead of roaming the street, searching for a street hail, or perpetually hoping for a dispatcher to call in his next fare, the driver is matched through GPS surveillance and algorithmic modeling to the fare closest to him. So if we're talking about traditional chauffeur workers in the regulated taxi industry, the labor platform might come as an incredible boon for working conditions. In fact, this is something that we were pushing for in the taxi industry before Uber came along. We wanted centralized dispatch. This is essentially what Uber is. Drivers would not need to work longer or harder to increase their productivity, and to the contrary, they could presumably raise wages while working for a shorter period of time. But in the Uber context, drivers are working harder and longer for lower wages compared to their pre-technology taxi comrades. And so why is that? Well, we maintain that the driving reason, no pun intended, is not technology, but instead an ideological commitment to regulatory evasion. For those of you who, like me, are not funny, you have to pre-plan your jokes. Uber does not just repudiate hard-fought-for taxi regulations on competition and fares. The company also entirely rejects any regulation over its relationship with its drivers. So Uber and practically all gig economy companies maintain, disingenuously in my making, that their drivers are independent contractors and not employees, thus depriving them of almost every safety net protection available under US law, because of course in the US we tie our safety nets to working. In this sense, Uber and similar labor platforms are the most recent step in a longer history of capital reorganization that involves the shift from a model of full-time work to one of contingent labor. But within that history of change, we maintain that the platform economy takes two further steps. First, big data and the algorithmic revolution enables a cyber-coordinated labor market, giving the employer tools to intensify, accelerate, and expand the market for contract labor, and also perhaps to intensify and expand its control and surveillance over workers. And second, corporate decisions embedded in the platform's algorithms enable a certain kind of hyper-exploitation in which supply outsources demand, wages are constrained, and workers, because of their legal status as independent contractors, must work harder and longer to eke out a living without the limited comforts of a minimum wage. So why then, you may ask, isn't the solution to this dystopic world of work just more regulation? Namely, why is the solution not converting drivers from independent contractors to employees? Well, in my empirical research, I found 3 key reasons that we might shy away from employment status. The first is that workers don't want to be employees. The second is that unions don't want to deal with the threat of antitrust litigation by organizing independent contractor labor. And the third is regulatory slippage. So let me take each of those assertions on their own and substantiate them with my empirical research. So first, workers do not want to be employees. So part of a larger project I have a survey project of Uber workers, and in that survey project, where we surveyed almost 250 workers, on the issue of many issues, but including the issue of what status they preferred, almost 75 to 70% of drivers said that they wanted to be independent contractors. And when asked why, of course, the drivers who said they wanted to be independent contractors said because they wanted the flexibility, and of course the drivers that said they wanted to be employees said it was because they wanted the benefits, not surprising. No matter how we slice the data by immigration status, by gender, by age, by whether or not they were casual or full-time laborers, we maintained this 30-70 outcome. My ethnographic research actually troubles this data, and I argue in another paper that drivers actually harbor an ambivalent relationship towards both statuses, and that while many workers want or need the freedom and flexibility of being a small business person, they also badly need the security of employment benefits. But this sort of represents a real problem in worker organizing and worker collectivity issues that I talk about at length in actually 2 different papers. And again, this is a dissatisfying snippet. So having said that, even if workers did want to be considered employees of labor platforms for purposes of collective power, we argue that they face significant hurdles that may in fact be insurmountable. For example, even if a court were to determine that Uber drivers are employees under the National Labor Relations Act, Uber could then use that court decision to shift their business model and reclassify their workers as independent contractors. And in fact, this is exactly what FedEx did after the celebrated Alexander v. FedEx decision in 2014, in which the Ninth Circuit found FedEx ground delivery drivers to be employees of FedEx. They just shifted their business model so that a few months later, their workers were once again independent contractors and perhaps even more exploited than they were before. So because of this lurking reality, traditional unions since about February of 2016 have by and large shunned representing gig economy workers for fear of antitrust liability. So unions are concerned that they're going to be found guilty of price fixing for representing Uber drivers fighting for better wages, which is of course perverse. And traditional and non-traditional unions that have moved forward with organizing Uber drivers, like the machinists in New York and the Teamsters in Seattle, have either seen their efforts stalled by federal courts, or they have completely given up fighting for anything more than portable benefits and completely left aside crucial wage issues by contract. Completely left aside crucial wage issues. So for these reasons and others that I'm happy to get into in the Q&A, traditional union organizing will likely not be a successful vehicle for addressing worker exploitation on labor platforms, at least any time in the foreseeable future. So finally, our third explanation for why we do not want to go the traditional regulatory route in the labor platform context is the long history of regulatory slippage. So in a historical article that recently came out in the Berkeley Journal of Employment and Labor Law, I show how in the early half of the 20th century, actually before the passage of the National Labor Relations Act, collective labor organizing in the San Francisco taxi worker community resulted in high regulation and secure work conditions. And for those of you who are familiar with the politics of the AFL in the early half of the 20th century, you might be sort of stunned by that. I also show how in the latter half of the same century, those regulations gradually unraveled in response to shifting union politics and evolving business models. So if the past is to serve as a roadmap for the future, relying on regulations to secure the future of labor platform work seems foolhardy. So in other places and in other pieces, I've argued that the solution to the exploitation and precarities of the gig economy is really a groundswell of worker organizing that sort of disregards the employee status issue, that puts it aside in this otherwise atomized and exploitative digitally enabled workplace. But in this paper, we push one step beyond this call. So if workers are to engage in the immense struggles of organizing and building collective power, we want to suggest that the collective power be leveraged to build something greater than an insecure bargain with capital. So I began this talk by exploring the ways in which the use of technology is perhaps different in its potential impact on the production process. Namely, I argued that by speeding up transactions, labor platforms have the capacity to actually improve the experience and quality of work. So as we move into Sushil's portion of our presentation, I want to end by suggesting that the cooperatively owned labor platform may be the best route forward in the digitally enabled service economy. And rather than being a naive, sort of nostalgic nod to a earlier moment in the US work imaginary, Sushil and I maintain that technology's application to worker cooperatives may actually enable new worlds of work. So if algorithms contain embodied values, then perhaps those values may reflect something more than efficiency and profit maximization. Perhaps more egalitarian values can, through a process of democratic governance, be embedded with digital commitments to things like work-life balance, living wages, and even anti-discrimination practices. We conjecture that if agreed upon governance structures and values are encoded in the platform, then the sometimes fatal co-op governance complications may be circumscribed. And this isn't to say that worker consensus building won't be continually informing algorithmic adjustments. Of course, they have to, but only that certain agreed upon values may become entrenched in actual work practices through the uniformity of application enabled by code. So platform technologies then may facilitate worker cooperatives 2.0, a world of work in which democratic governance and sustainable working conditions are embedded in the mathematical processes of digitally enabled labor. So I'll leave it to Sushil to tell you sort of the how, and so much as my presentation was on the why.
Thank you, Veena. That was really exciting. I feel really like revolutionary right now. Just want you to know that Veena and I selected the same PowerPoint template independently of each other and just discovered it right before this. That's how linked and seamless this paper is.
Maybe you're part of it.
So as Veena was saying, my section of the paper will talk about both algorithmic governance and the structure of a democratic firm in the TNC and eventually in platform co-ops in general. But today I'm talking about the structure of democratic firms for on-demand drivers. I'm going to focus first on the micro level, the relationship of the individual service providers with their workers, either as partners or as employees. And then I want to talk about the macro level of how do we get from where we are right now to this larger sense of a platform co-op that can actually compete with established players like Uber. So first, let's talk about what's been tried. Professor at NYU Business School, Arun Sundarajan, says about Uber, it's not quite as clear-cut, but if you look at all the different dimensions of their execution, The driver relationship is the weakest, and it's not one that they can easily correct. Acting on that insight was a company called Juno in New York City that attempted to win over drivers. They identified that they could beat Uber at their game by being better to their drivers. They tried to do this by offering restricted stock units to their drivers. The problem with the restricted stock units was that they were contingent rights. They weren't vested in the drivers yet, so the drivers didn't really have that much control over certain things like the valuation of those stock units. Well, it turns out that Juno was made an offer it couldn't refuse. It was acquired by another platform tech company called Get for $200 million, and now those drivers' restricted stock units are being paid off at 2 cents a share. So a driver who had earned 14,000 of these stock units gets $251. The drivers are really pissed, but it's also an opening to talk about a democratic alternative to a restricted stock unit. Another example of what's been tried is in Austin, after Uber and Lyft decided they were going to abandon the city due to the city's increasing the regulation, there's been a whole host of platform alternatives that have cropped up, including Ride Austin, which is actually a nonprofit platform. And the reason why this nonprofit platform is so exciting is because as a nonprofit, it actually has a mission of sharing all of the underlying data with the public. So it has a commitment to open data, to provide transparency and provide research, promote research. So hopefully it would make your work much easier, Krista. So I submit that there are interesting alternatives like nonprofits, but I question whether a nonprofit can actually compete with something like Uber outside of the specific particular regulatory situation of a city like Austin. So outside of Austin, what are we going to do? Well, as Veena has been suggesting, we're talking about this idea of platform cooperatives. And the idea of worker ownership and worker cooperatives is long and well known. I want to talk about first at the level of the micro firm, the worker co-op, a collection of workers together in their own entity. There's two traditional ways in which workers come together. The first is what's called a general partnership, and the second is an employment relationship, which today people talk about as union co-ops. First, what is a partnership? You are all familiar with partnerships because, I mean, in law schools, we're told about these big law firms, and they're supposedly organized as partnerships. I found Jones Day's website really ironic because they are advertising themselves as a true partnership, but what they mean by that is that they don't have any non-equity partners or fake partners. They don't talk about any of the associates working at the firm and all the labor they're providing. I'm not talking about this type of partnership, and in fact, I'm not even going to recommend partnership as a solution in our paper because there's so much legal risk and uncertainty involved with who is truly a partner, and there's a lot of litigation around whether an employee is really a partner, and we often advise our clients to be very careful if they're going down this route of creating a worker co-op in which they're going to avoid employment classification by calling all their workers partners. There's a valid way to do it, and law firms and accounting firms do it all the time, but in the specific industries I work with, especially around low-skilled workers who are not actually investing that much capital in their business, the factors that courts use to determine whether someone's a true partner really actually looks at how much capital you've invested in your business and how much individual control you as a partner have over your own work life and over the partnership. When we're talking about an Uber alternative of 10,000 drivers who are dispatched by an app, partnership could be a risky option for them. Alternatively, we also look at union co-ops. What is a union co-op? Well, here's a helpful model. A cooperative, as you may or may not know, is an entity that has members. A worker cooperative has worker members. That means that the workers are owners of the entity. So in a union worker co-op, the cooperative has its worker owners. They elect the board of directors because they're the shareholders of the corporation. They also elect a union committee. The board of the corporation appoints management. Management bargains with the union committee, and the management runs the business. You may ask, well, why do you even need a union committee and management if the co-op is owned by its own workers? The problem with, the reason why this has arisen is because we have experience with very large worker cooperatives, such as the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain, which have 80,000 worker owners, and an individual worker actually has the same issues that a shop floor worker would have in a normal capitalist firm, which is that they don't actually have that much control over their day-to-day work environment, and they do need representation to talk to management, and management is actually quite distant from them. And in these large-scale platform co-ops that we hope to build, that if we're successful, that will be the case, that there will be some distance because this is going to be an enormous firm. So union co-ops could be a model for organizing the particular labor relationship inside this micro firm. But what I really want to talk about today is the macro firm, because from my experience, if we don't get to scale, none of these small experiments we're trying all over the country with Uber alternatives are going to mean anything, because Uber's playing a waiting game. They have enough capital to continue subsidizing low fares that all of these alternatives are just going to go out of business. So how do we beat them at that waiting game? We have to utilize the labor advantage we have that Professor Sundararajan had talked about, and that is to organize drivers into their own cooperatives. Co-ops are an interesting creature. They are somewhat capitalist, and yet they're non-capitalist. Under U.S. law, and every state has its own co-op law. In California, it's a corporation. It has you have classes of shares in a cooperative. The membership share is basically the common stock of the corporation. You can add preferred shares to allow for outside investment. What's really exciting about co-ops is that they have these principles baked into the state laws that require one member, one vote, and they require that upon a liquidity event, the residual assets are paid off to membership based on how you've defined the membership's relationship to the co-op. Let me give you an example. So in a worker co-op, workers work, they get wages. They vote for the board based on being one member, one vote. They get profit sharing based on how much relative work they did for the corporation. If there was going to be a liquidity event, if there was a merger, if they were bought out by Get, they would actually get the proceeds from that sale based on their historic patronage of the firm, not based on how much capital they invested. So that's the way in which co-ops are really non-capitalist firms in a capitalist economy. The traditional platform structures we're seeing for worker co-ops, I think, are quite myopic because they conceive of the co-op as its own individual unit owning the intellectual property asset. And the problem with that is you're never going to compete with Uber as one small co-op with your own app. It's prohibitively expensive to keep developing apps and to maintain them to the level that Uber and Lyft do. The union's on the outside because sometimes unions are involved with starting these co-ops. An example is Green Taxi Co-op in Denver. There's 800 taxi drivers. They were union-backed. They are basically all North African, African immigrant driver owners. They've each put in $2,000, and they have their own app that they've developed for themselves. So far, the app is functioning, but the problem is it's never going to look as nice as an Uber or Lyft app. And if you're worried about customer service issues, it's really incumbent on them to invest and continue to invest in that app. And that's the first place they're going to want to cut their costs. So what I want to talk about is some insights that we've had in the co-op movement, which is that there's a long history of co-ops achieving scale, and the way they've done it is not operating as individual co-ops. It's by banding together into large movements of co-ops. I'll give you 3 examples. Organic Valley, farmers. Mondragon, an enormous worker co-op, and National Co-op Grocers Association. First, the farmers. They offer tons of services to their members. Organic Valley has 2,000 farmers. The types of services they include are marketing your products. You start an organic farm, you sign up for the co-op, we give you a brand name, we give you access to grocery stores, and we give you a stable price. We give you even veterinary support for your cows. It's an amazing plug-and-play model, and it gives you a national brand to plug into. Second is Mondragon. I mentioned they have 74,000 employees across 147 subsidiary corporations. They're one of the largest firms in Spain. But they don't operate, they operate using what's called second-level co-ops, which is basically, they have tons of different industries that share resources and do R&D together. They have a bank together, and they have a brand name together. The grocers in the United States, National Cooperative Grocers Association, if you go to small consumer co-ops, like I think Cambridge has a food co-op, it's plugged into the National Cooperative Grocers Association, which acts as their distributor. And it connects them with a tech cooperative, which allows them to do the data analysis to keep them competitive with Whole Foods and other big grocery retail stores. So this already happens. And what I'm proposing is we do the same thing for platform co-ops. We reimagine that each worker co-op is a member of a larger federated co-op. And then we, as a federated co-op, build an app. And there's a lot of ways to conceive of how that relationship could go, but one I'm suggesting is because of the particularities of app developers right now being able to command premium prices for everything they do, would be to create a joint venture between the federation and the tech company where both can profit from the success of the app. They share control over that intellectual property asset, and they also share the control of the data. There's a role for public-private partnerships here where the outside investors could even be cities that would invest in that underlying app in exchange for control of that data. So that's where I think if we are going to have a chance to compete with Uber, cooperation amongst cooperatives could be a way. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for questions and conversation. And let me open it up, and I'll also, of course, invite the panelists to ask each other questions if they would like to do so. And if not, okay, I was going to say if not, I've got a question ready to go, but I'd rather defer to the audience. So go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much. Is this on? Yeah. All right. So, have you guys looked into, especially with the final two speakers, have you looked into the coordinated market economies of Europe a little bit more? So Spain obviously has really, really solid cooperative work going on, and of course, recently pretty bad economy in the world stage. But looking up towards especially the Scandinavian countries, Germany, France also, they have these coordinated market economies. And I'm just wondering, have you looked into that kind of social policy behind being able to enable that, or perhaps what has brought on the ability to pass social policy that has brought that coordination that you guys might be talking about?
So, no, my research on, I have done some sort of transnational research on how Northern European countries and unions in particular have been dealing with the phenomenon of the gig economy. And I think that part of what you may be getting at is that there's just such an essentially vastly different structure of safety net benefits throughout Northern Europe. And so I think that there is a much better regulatory structure in place to coordinate and facilitate this type of governance structure, certainly better than what we have here. So, and Sushil can talk more to this since he actually worked on this, but even part of what we're seeing in the US is not just oh, no one's thought about this, but there are actual legal things, actual legal barriers in place to achieving something like this. So in California, part of what Sushil worked on was 2012, 2014. was to make it easier for workers without capital to start co-ops. And the fact that we just sort of have this sort of implicit cultural bias even in the law to make something like that so difficult, I think speaks to sort of the larger differences certainly between the Scandinavian nations and the US, and how we think about capital in relationship to work and social benefits and workers, et cetera. Do you want to talk about that, the California law?
Not really, I think. But I actually haven't looked into coordinated market economy, so now I'll look into it.
Hi, I'm Frank from Maryland, and I just wanted to say this was just an amazing panel, and I wanted to make one comment about how it all fits together and just see if there were any reactions to this think theory, because to me what really crystallized the role of academic work in reframing here was Jason's point about the reversing the positive political economy, public choice theory that workers are these concentrated gouging interests and consumers are this big undifferentiated mass that's constantly getting gouged. And I think even if we go back to like James Q. Whitman's work on producerism versus consumerism, we see that theme. And you see it particularly in the Federal Trade Commission, which I now call our anti-labor department. I think the Federal Trade Commission is now so concentrated on going after church organists, skating coaches, anyone that tries to sort of develop some type of cooperative approach to labor. And what I wanted to say is what I hope is that the work that you're doing, Christo, really lays the foundation, an empirical foundation, to validate some of to further buttress Jason's insights about the nature of the relative power of these two groups, that will finally get the Office of Policy Planning at the FTC to stop policing things like cooperatives or other things. Because the only worry, I guess, in my question would be, do you worry at all that the antitrust scrutiny that would come to unions trying to organize independent contractors would also come to cooperatives, or is there a way that cooperatives have immunized themselves from that?
Well, cooperatives ag co-ops are actually exempt from antitrust liability. But there's a Capitalism exemption, but that doesn't apply to these new co-ops. And so we would just need really good antitrust lawyers advising us on how to structure that relationship between the Federation and its members.
Hi, I have the mic here. Jenny Stevens, I'm a professor here at Northeastern. Thank you again. Thank you for the panel. I had a question about business school education. And I'm curious, I guess, thinking about all four speakers, how, first of all, in terms of cooperative models and alternative structures of organizations, how much of that is taught at all in business schools? And I don't know if any of you know the answer to that. But also in terms of the internet and the influence of, you know, this kind of lobbying that internet companies can get their customers to participate in. I was just curious if any of you know about how that is like policy and lobbying and that kind of thing also to what degree is that integrated into business school education? I'm just curious, and I know this isn't, I don't know if anyone here has business school background or education, but it just struck me that both of these issues are things that could and should, you know, be addressed in you'd think, management school education, so.
I don't think it's part of mainstream business curricula to talk about co-ops at all, and that's very frustrating.
I would add that's my experience as well as somebody who teaches a course on community development in which I include discussions of co-ops, partly because of Jim Rowan's influence on me, who's the director of our poverty law clinic and is seated in the back, hidingly. There's, when I have joint MBA, JD students in my class, the materials on worker co-op are news to them. And I'll add one sentence, which is it seems partly related to the focus on shareholder profit and the shareholder profit motive, which is at odds with that capitalist piece of the worker co-op model that Sushil was talking about.
So I'll just jump in just to add to this. I mean, yeah, so I agree. It's not in the mainstream. It's not totally absent, but it really varies by school. For example, at MIT, there's a a thing called the Sustainability Initiative, which draws in a reasonable, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but a reasonable proportion of MBAs who are interested in issues of sustainability broadly. And so students who opt into those kinds of groups and the kinds of classes that go along with them are more likely to get exposure to both alternative organizational forms like co-ops on one hand, certainly alternative organizational objectives, so going beyond sort of profit maximization, shareholder value, and so forth. But I would agree, it tends not to be in the mainstream, but it is part of the discourse in a number of places. I think, and also in terms of lobbying, I think that's actually what I've seen very, very little of in my sort of interactions in business school, both teaching and interacting with colleagues in business schools. That tends to be, I think, quite absent. My guess is that perhaps more in law schools, it's sort of, you're more likely to see more, but it's kind of missing in business schools, and I think it's actually part of the overarching, I hate the word ideology, but for lack of belief systems under which business schools operate, that, not so much simplistically that regulation is bad, but rather that regulation is sort of off to the side and, let's operate as if we're in an institution-free environment, and much of the realities of dealing with the regulatory and policy environment don't get dealt with as much there, but much more in the sort of real world of business once people get out and get their MBAs and so forth.
And this is purely anecdotal, and I could be wrong, it's certainly very cynical, but something that I'm seeing more of in Silicon Valley firms, which I think ultimately will have a trickle-down effect into what is taught in business school context, is as opposed to hiring outside lobbyists, firms like Lyft and Uber and all of these tech companies, and I think probably more and more just even non-tech companies in general, have their public policy people internal to the firm, and I think, and I could be naive about this, but I think that that's kind of a relatively new phenomenon, where instead of hiring outside people to deal with public governance, they actually have internal people private to their firm or their institution working on public governance issue and actually having an impact in the ways that Jason is talking about on public governance in kind of scary ways. And those folks are all from business schools. The people that are doing public policy work, they're not from public policy schools. And so I would be interested to see if that has had any impact on the educational environment in business schools, or not at all. And you actually interviewed my friend who did that. Was there anything interesting about?
Yeah, I've interviewed a couple of people on the sort of policy side, which, you get interesting sorts of insights and so forth, which you can talk more about offline.
So I'm going to insert a question here, and it's really just a chance for really Veena and Sushil, but also Jason, to get information out of Christo, and for Christo to react to like Frank was asking for reactions between Christo and Jason, to react to this idea of using co-ops of co-ops or associations of co-ops to achieve scalability just from a tech perspective, right? Does that seem like something that could work to you? And I guess what piece of information would you try to give these guys and try to do it? And then I have the same question for you in reverse for the two of you, for Christo.
So I'm intrigued by this idea. If you look at what's happening at a company like Uber, a lot of it is very top-down driven. It's not that the tech is inherently bad, right? There's decisions being made at the top that are perhaps not so great, and it's surprising the degree to which the engineers then just do stuff that is clearly unethical. It doesn't have to be that way, right? There are good ideas for alternative structures. My only word of caution is, you were talking a little bit about implementing these kinds of more egalitarian policies in code, and that could very well work and be good. Code is nice and clean that way. It executes and does the same thing again and again. But turning human policies and ideas about fairness into code is surprisingly difficult. And it's something that you really have to be constantly reevaluating, right? Especially if we're talking about a partnership between a co-op and like a developer. The developer's interests may not be necessarily aligned 100% with the co-ops, or maybe they're just sloppy. But making sure that what your ideals are actually being represented on the ground is tricky. I don't think anyone on the CS side has really figured that out yet, other than just to keep looking and be aware. But it's just, there's a potential gotcha there.
Yeah. I was thinking even more simple things like Lyft and their app has after 10 hours of driving, it's so interesting. It's just internalized public regulations in the app. So in the taxi industry, you drive for 10 hours, that's the end of your shift. You're not allowed to drive anymore because of driver fatigue issues. In the Lyft app, after driving for 10 hours, your app is actually automatically turned off for 6 hours to force you to sleep, essentially, and that is not the case. That's not the case at all in Uber, as you can imagine. And so I was imagining just like even sort of stops like that, internal stops like that, because part of what you find in the worker cooperative context, just like I lived for almost 20 years in Berkeley, which is like the world of consensus building and democracy, and so you hear these stories from friends who are in cooperatives and worker cooperatives where they just like, it becomes about exploiting each other on some level, and ultimately leads to the dissolution of the co-op, and there's something about being able to say, okay, you work 8 hours a day, and that's actually enabled in the app, so that sort of worker parity issues like that are constricted by mathematical application, and can't be sort of diffused and overrun by human greed or I like those are the potentialities I saw in this idea.
And just to add to that, to Vina's idea is that this can be built into the democratic structure. Usually worker co-ops have annual meetings. Co-ops have annual meetings, all co-ops, and they bring shareholder member proposals that could then be encoded. Like if that proposal passes, we're going to have an 8-hour cap that would be encoded into the app. And that's one of the exciting possibilities of platform co-ops.
Yeah, so I think that's great. And this starts to subtly get into kind of the design issues of these systems. Like Uber and Lyft have this system where it used to be that you would complete a ride and then you would sit. And then a new request would come in and you would take it. So there was some idle time. Now they try to pipeline you. So as you're finishing your current ride, it pops up and says, your next one's ready, right? As soon as this person's dropped off, start driving again, and you never have to stop working. So there's kind of a button into the corner that says, please turn me off. But it's really designed to encourage you to keep working, keep working, keep working. And this is a subtle, not so subtle cue from them to like keep people on the road. That's the kind of design issue that probably a co-op should be thinking about. Totally. Is that the kind of behavior we want to encourage? Right? Is that right? How much time should there be? How should that cue be implemented? Because the way it appears on the screen, the sounds it makes, the size of the button, all influence people's behavior. This is a lever that someone unscrupulous can turn, but that could also be turned towards good.
Yeah. I remember early in, I guess this was a Law and Society 2013 or 2014, Jason and I were talking about Uber, and I had just finished my dissertation on taxi work, and I was like, oh, for the love of God, now I have to keep writing and keep researching because I can't write this book. But on the other hand, all of a sudden people are interested in taxi drivers, which was great for me. And Jason is saying, like one of the potential awesome things about Uber is that like people will stop for me now, like I can get a ride, and like things like that can be built in like that. There is potential there, right? Like Airbnb refuses to take their pictures off of their app, which could clearly address all the discrimination that their users are experiencing. There are ways in which just like simple buttons could eliminate just discriminatory decisions that both riders and drivers choose to make.
So we have, one more question, I think, unless Jessica allows me to go a little over. Okay, 2 more questions.
All right, I'll keep it quick. It kind of builds on what you guys were just talking about, which is, I think it was Peter Drucker said culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack, whatever. And how much of this conversation, specifically about alternative models, a co-op model, are driven from the fact that, if Travis Kalanick was a different person, who knows? Like, you say it was a bug. Yeah, I'd be curious. Gray ball might have been a bug. I don't know. But how much of this conversation is tied to the fact that it's people writing code. It's a certain type of person leading versus. Do you think that this kind of model, this Uber model, even with the right, the right approach to how they deal with the contractors and the community, is still kind of destined for issues? So how much of it is tied to sort of the people, the culture that's been instilled here versus just this model is doomed at some point?
And why don't we cluster the questions?
That's a good question.
Take this one.
So my question is actually thank you so much for this panel, by the way. It was really amazing. With this proposed joint venture corporate entity that owns the app as an intellectual property asset, I'm wondering if you guys have heard any interest from Silicon Valley in funding something like this. The thing is, I know that this seems really outside how we think about Uber and the new Silicon Valley, but this model of the corporate entity that holds that intellectual property and then licenses it out and doesn't even necessarily only distribute it for profit, that is something that we've seen before. It was how Sun Microsystems operated with Java, and it's how Mozilla Foundation operates, and Mozilla Foundation is not profitable yet, but that's a structure we've seen before. So have you heard anything from venture capitalists?
Do you know some venture capitalists we can talk to? No, but I think this is the beginning of a conversation.
I mean, this is the first time that Sushil and I have presented.
Yeah.
I finished this talk last night at 2 a.m.
Thanks.
Maybe can I speak to your greater question? I think that there is this very I think it's a wonderful question, and I have been really frustrated. I think by sort of when there was the delete Uber movement during the Muslim ban outcry, and everyone was like, oh, let's use Lyft, and I'm like, but Lyft is the same exact thing, and they're riding the coattails off of being the less evil doppelganger of Uber, right? And so I interact with these Silicon Valley folks a lot, and it is not just bad behavior. It is an ideological commitment that is really hard to break through. It is an ideological commitment to abhorring government regulation and to the free market and to the rational actor. And a refusal, a real refusal, by people who I think are as progressive, dear friends who work at Lyft, who I think of as progressives, who have worked on East Coast Democrat campaigns, for years and years and years and years, just think that this is the bee's knees. And so, which is, I think, part of this technological fetishism that has led regulators across the country to deregulate the taxi industry. And so, you said, is the model doomed at some point? I think that for workers it's doomed. I don't think for capital it's doomed. I think it's an extremely profitable model that proliferates every day, and that we will continue to see until there is some sort of breaking point, some sort of disruption. The type of working conditions that you now see. I used to think that working conditions in the taxi industry were bad. I had friends when I was doing my research who slept in their cars, who in the extraordinarily dystopian San Francisco couldn't afford housing, didn't have food security, but the level of precarity that Uber and Lyft drivers are experiencing is, I can only analogize it to my experiences working in India, in the informal service market. There are migrant workers, people who actually couch surf in LA, who drive up every day to San Francisco where the fares are slightly higher, and drive 23 hours, who sleep in their cars, and who are still sometimes only making their lease fee, because Uber engages in this absurd subprime loan program where they also more and more and more and more money, where they're leasing vehicles for far above their blue book value. And so I feel like this model is not necessarily doomed from the perspective of capital, but it is doomed from the perspective of worker, and the kind of work that it's producing is so incredibly dystopic. It's so it is. I cannot describe to you how how fearful I feel on an everyday basis when I'm working with workers around like what this is producing. And so part of what I'm such a hammer. I was telling Jason this, like my work is like I walk around and I'm like, no, this sucks, And so this is like I'm a critical empiricist, and so having this possibility, working with Sushi on this sort of possibility of an intervention, has been really sort of inspiring and hopeful to me.
Can I just add something very quickly to that? So this may I don't know if this removes the dystopic or furthers the dystopic, but I'd add a slightly. I mean, maybe this is good for capital. This is good, I think, for speculative capital.
Right.
It's unclear whether this is good for capital in some general sense, because none of these firms have turned a profit. And the fundamental way that the business model works of the firms that are always at the forefront of our minds when we think of the sharing and gig economy, which of course are Uber and Lyft and so forth, is heavily subsidized rides based on the ability to attract massive capital injections through multiple rounds of venture financing from increasingly wealthy and closed sources. So think sovereign wealth funds, for example, from Saudi Arabia, right, for instance, right? So, which is simply to say places where there's lots of money that are willing to, which is flush in a low interest rate environment, et cetera, and so forth. So it's unclear, actually, I think, where this is all going, even from a capital standpoint. But whether that means, there's always the kind of operating in the background idea of a kind of return to a kind of previous sort of better world, whether it be the Fordist Keynesian world, which is a sort of general thing in our political environment now, I guess. But whether it's that sort of, imaginary of the past or something else in the future, we don't know. But I think the future is a lot less clear, even from a capital perspective. Though from a labor perspective, all these challenges are very, very real.
Let's give the panel another round of applause. Thank you very much.